Hello, sleep seekers. Today we're going as slow as it takes to make a Japanese tea. Nothing urgent and not much to imagine. Today, we're diving into the story of the imperfect bowl. The ritual that involves spending 4 years learning how to boil water and another 4 learning how to wipe a bowl that is already clean. The room is 6 tatami mats wide. It smells of straw, dried rush, and the faint, dusty scent of old paper. It is a smell that reminds you of a library that hasn't been opened since the Edo period. Outside, the rain is doing exactly what rain ought to do in Kyoto. It is falling with a polite, persistent melancholy. The tatami mat beneath your knees makes the faintest whisper when you shift your weight. A sound like rice paper being folded, though considerably less interesting. This is important to mention because you'll be sitting on these woven rush mats for approximately 4 hours, which is, by any reasonable measure, quite a long time to wait for a cup of tea. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Let's begin properly, at the beginning, which in this case means China, because almost everything interesting about Japanese culture seems to have started there first. Tea arrived in Japan sometime around the 9th century, carried by Buddhist monks who had traveled to China and apparently thought, yes, what our meditation practices truly need is caffeine. The monk Eisai is usually credited with bringing tea seeds back to Japan in 1191, though one suspects he brought other things as well. Scrolls, perhaps, or a nice set of robes. But history only seems interested in the tea. Eisai wrote a book called Kissa Yojoki, which translates to Drinking Tea for Health, a title that suggests he understood marketing before marketing was properly invented. Initially, tea was medicinal. It was used to keep monks awake during meditation, which seems rather to defeat the purpose of meditation, but theology has never been my strong suit. The tea they drank was quite different from what we might imagine. They ground tea leaves into a powder and whisked it with hot water, creating a frothy, bitter concoction that was apparently good for one's constitution. The bitterness is worth noting. This wasn't Earl Grey with a splash of milk. This was matcha, earthy, vegetal, the color of a forest floor after rain, and about as subtle. The preparation itself demanded attention. The tea bowl, called a chawan, was often rough to the touch, deliberately imperfect, with a glaze that might drip unevenly down one side, like honey that's lost interest halfway through its journey. You'd cradle this bowl in both hands, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic. And if you were doing it properly, you'd admire the way the green tea powder had been whisked into tiny bubbles at the surface, each bubble catching the light from the paper screens in its own infinitesimal way. But let's move forward chronologically, because that's what historians do. Even sleepy ones. By the 13th century, the samurai class had developed a fondness for tea. These were warriors, mind you, men whose day jobs involved rather a lot of violence, and yet they found themselves drawn to sitting in small rooms and drinking bitter green beverages. There's probably something profound in that, though at this hour I'm not certain what. They held tea parties, tocha they called them, which were essentially gambling events where participants had to guess which tea came from which region. Imagine armored warriors sitting around, sipping carefully, furrowing their brows, and saying things like, yes, I detect notes of Uji terroir. It's rather endearing, actually. The rooms where they drank their tea were not yet the refined spaces we associate with tea ceremony today. They were larger, more boisterous.
There might be Chinese paintings on the walls, scrolls depicting misty mountains or scholars contemplating waterfalls, and expensive ceramics displayed on shelves. It was all rather showy, which seems to have bothered a monk named Murata Juko. Juko, who lived in the 15th century, had ideas about tea that involved less showing off and more, well, sitting quietly. He studied Zen Buddhism, which is essentially a philosophy about doing very little in a very particular way, and he thought perhaps tea drinking should be more like that. Simpler, more austere. He introduced the concept of wabi, a term that defies easy translation, but roughly means finding beauty in simplicity and imperfection, in things that are humble and understated. Picture this. Instead of expensive Chinese ceramics, you might use a tea bowl made by a local potter, something with an uneven rim and a thumbprint pressed into the clay. Instead of a grand room, perhaps a smaller space, more intimate. Instead of many guests, perhaps just a few. Instead of conversation about politics or war, perhaps silence, or the sound of water beginning to boil in the iron kettle. That sound, incidentally, is called matsukaze, pine wind, because the bubbles forming at the bottom of the kettle supposedly sound like wind moving through pine trees. Whether they actually do is debatable, but it's a lovely thought. And when you're sitting in a tea room at dawn, with incense smoke curling upward in the still air and light barely filtering through the shoji screens, you might convince yourself you hear it. A gentle rumbling, a whisper of movement, the promise that water is doing what water does, which is transformed from one state to another at precisely 80 degrees Celsius.
Juko's ideas were refined further by a man named Takeno Ju, who gets less attention in the history books despite being rather important. Ju emphasized sabi, another untranslatable term meaning something like the beauty of age and wear, the patina of time. A tea bowl that had been used for decades, perhaps slightly chipped, its glaze crazed with tiny cracks. This was more valuable than something new and perfect. But the person who truly codified the tea ceremony, who turned it into the art form we recognize today, was Sen no Rikyū. Rikyū lived in the 16th century and served as tea master to two of Japan's most powerful warlords, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. This seems like a stressful occupation, making tea for men who could have you executed on a whim, and indeed, Rikyū was eventually ordered to commit seppuku by Hideyoshi for reasons that remain historically murky. Perhaps he made the tea too strong, perhaps not strong enough, perhaps it had nothing to do with tea at all. Before his death, however, Rikyū established the principles that still govern tea ceremony today. He reduced the size of the tea room to just 4.5 tatami mats, roughly 9 feet square. He lowered the doorway so that everyone, regardless of rank, had to enter by crawling. He stripped away decoration, leaving only a simple scroll hanging in an alcove, perhaps a single flower in a bamboo vase. The flower should never be too showy. A camellia bloom perhaps, or a branch of plum blossom just beginning to open. The ceremony he designed proceeds in stages, each with its own particular rhythm. The host cleans each utensil, the tea scoop, the whisk, the bowl, with precise, deliberate movements that have been choreographed over centuries. The cleaning is part of the ceremony, you see. It's not that the utensils are actually dirty. It's that the act of cleaning them, slowly, methodically, with a silk cloth called a fukusa, creates a space for mindfulness. The host folds the fukusa in a specific way. There are entire schools of thought about fukusa, folding, and wipes the tea scoop, which is carved from a single piece of bamboo,
and has a name, because apparently even tea scoops deserve names. The scoop might be called Winter Moon or First Cicada, or something equally poetic that sounds rather silly when translated into English, but seems perfectly reasonable in Japanese. Then comes the ladling of water. The host uses a bamboo dipper to transfer hot water from the iron kettle to the tea bowl. The water makes a sound as it pours, a gentle rushing, like a distant stream, though considerably smaller and less interesting than an actual stream. But in the silence of the tea room, this sound becomes enormous. It fills the space. You can hear each individual drop, the way the water swirls inside the ceramic bowl, the slight echo it creates. The host adds matcha powder to the bowl. Just a few scoops, measured precisely. The powder sits there, dry and green, until more hot water is added, and then the whisking begins. The bamboo whisk, called a chasen, is a remarkable object. A single piece of bamboo split into dozens of fine tines, each one flexible and strong. The host whisks in a specific pattern, back and forth, rapidly, creating those tiny bubbles we mentioned earlier, until the tea reaches the proper consistency. Smooth, frothy, the color of jade. The bowl is turned, always clockwise, always twice, so that its most beautiful side faces the guest. This is important. The front of the bowl, decorated perhaps with a subtle glaze pattern or a painted design, should never face inward. It would be impolite. The bowl is offered with both hands placed on the tatami between host and guest. The guest bows, picks up the bowl, bows again. The guest then turns the bowl, counterclockwise, twice, so as not to drink from its front, which would also be impolite, as it might damage the decoration. The guest takes a sip. The tea is bitter, earthy, with that distinctive umami richness that matcha provides. It's not everyone's cup of tea, if you'll pardon the expression. The guest takes another sip, perhaps two more, and then wipes the rim of the bowl with their fingers, turns it back to its original position, and returns it to the host. This entire process might take 45 minutes for one bowl of tea, which again is quite a long time. But duration is rather the point, isn't it? The tea ceremony, chanoyu or sado, is not actually about tea, or not primarily. It's about creating a space separate from ordinary life, a space where the usual concerns, money, status, tomorrow's weather, become irrelevant. For 4 hours, you sit on tatami mats in a small room, and your entire universe shrinks to the sound of water boiling, the texture of ceramic, the smell of incense and green tea. The incense, by the way, is typically a subtle variety, perhaps sandalwood or aloes wood, burned in small amounts so it doesn't overwhelm the senses. It should be barely noticeable, just a suggestion in the air, like a memory of fragrance rather than fragrance itself. The tea room might have a garden visible through an opening. Not a grand garden with elaborate landscaping, but a roji, a dewy path with stepping stones and perhaps a stone water basin where guests purify their hands before entering. The stones are slightly irregular, placed so you must watch your step, must pay attention. Even the walk to the tea room becomes part of the practice. Inside, the light is carefully controlled. It filters through shoji screens made of wooden lattices covered with translucent paper, creating a soft, diffuse glow that changes throughout the day. Morning light is different from afternoon light, which is different from the light at dusk. The seasons matter too. In summer, the host might use a shallow tea bowl that allows the tea to cool more quickly. In winter, a deeper bowl retains heat. These details accumulate into meaning. There are dozens of schools of tea ceremony today. each descended from Sen no Rikyū's 3 great-grandsons, who founded their own traditions after a family disagreement about, one assumes, the proper way to fold a fukusa. The Urasenke school is perhaps the largest, followed by Omote-senke and Mushikochi-senke. They differ in small ways: the angle at which the whisk is held, the number of times the fukusa is folded, whether one wears one's watch on the left wrist or the right. To an outsider, these differences are invisible. To practitioners, they are everything. Learning tea ceremony takes years. Decades, really. One begins by learning how to walk properly on tatami, heel to toe, sliding slightly, never making a sound. Then how to sit in seiza, that particular kneeling position that cuts off circulation to one's feet and creates the peculiar sensation of walking on cotton wool afterward. Then how to bow. There are multiple types of bows, each calibrated to specific situations. Then, eventually, how to handle the utensils, how to fold the fukusa, how to whisk the tea. Master tea practitioners can perform the ceremony with such fluidity that the movements appear effortless, almost invisible. Each gesture flows into the next, like water finding its course. This effortlessness, of course, is the result of thousands of hours of practice, of muscle memory so deeply ingrained that thought becomes unnecessary. The body simply knows what to do. And perhaps that's the real history here. Not dates and names and political context, but the history of people sitting down, over and over, century after century, trying to make a decent bowl of tea, trying to create a moment of peace in a world that rarely provides such things, trying to find beauty in simplicity, meaning in repetition, connection in silence. The ceremony continues today, much as it did in Rikyū's time, though now some tea rooms have electric kettles instead of charcoal braziers, which seems rather to miss the point, but is admittedly more convenient. The forms persist, the movements endure. Somewhere right now, in Kyoto or Tokyo, or perhaps London or New York, someone is whisking matcha in a ceramic bowl, creating those tiny bubbles, preparing to serve tea to a guest. The bowl will be turned twice. The tea will be bitter and green. The room will be quiet except for the sound of water, pine wind, matsukaze. And it will take quite a long time, which is precisely as it should be. The charcoal used in traditional tea ceremony deserves its own consideration, though I realize this may not sound immediately riveting. But bear with me, or rather, don't. Feel free to drift off at any moment. The charcoal is called sumi, and it's not simply grabbed from any old fire. It's made from specific woods, oak, camellia, cherry, and shaped into precise geometric forms. Some pieces are cylindrical, others rectangular, still others shaped like hexagons, because apparently even charcoal needs architectural interest. When charcoal catches properly, it doesn't flame. It glows. A deep orange glow that radiates warmth without drama, without crackling or spitting. It's the sort of heat that seeps into your bones slowly, over the course of an hour, until you realize you've stopped being cold without noticing the transition. The scent it produces is subtle, woody, clean, like standing in a forest that's been very slightly toasted. The arrangement of charcoal in the brazier follows patterns that have names. There's the foundation piece, laid first, which supports the others. Then comes the body piece, then the front piece. The host arranges them with metal chopsticks called hibashi, moving each piece with the sort of deliberation usually reserved for defusing explosives, though considerably less exciting. The water in the iron kettle, the kama, sits above this charcoal, is heating at a pace that could most generously be described as glacial. Modern people, accustomed to electric kettles that boil water in 90 seconds, might find this frustrating. The tea ceremony practitioner finds it meditative, or at least claims to. One watches tiny bubbles form at the bottom of the kettle, each one clinging to the iron surface, before finally releasing and rising through the water, disappearing at the surface with the faintest whisper. The iron itself is worth examining, though not too closely, as that would be rude. His tea kettles are often quite old, decades old, sometimes centuries, and the iron develops a particular patina over time. It's rust, essentially, but dignified rust, rust with purpose. The inside of the kettle becomes coated with minerals from the water, creating a surface that supposedly improves the flavor of subsequent water, though I suspect this is the sort of thing one tells oneself after spending several months' salary on a kettle. Some kettles have designs cast into their surfaces, geometric patterns, landscapes, even calligraphy. Others are perfectly plain, their only ornament being the slight irregularities of the casting process. The tiny pits and bumps that prove this object was made by hand, by someone who may well be dead now, but whose work persists in boiling water for strangers. The sound of the kettle changes as the water heats. At first, silence, then a faint ticking, almost inaudible, then a gentle rumbling, those bubbles we mentioned earlier, the pine wind. Then, if one isn't careful, a full boil, which is considered rather gauche. The water should be just below boiling, around 80 degrees Celsius, hot enough to extract the tea's flavors, but not so hot as to make it bitter, though matcha is already bitter, so perhaps this is splitting hairs, which is itself rather in keeping with the spirit of tea ceremony. The seasons dictate much about how tea is prepared and served. In January, for instance, one might use a specific type of tea bowl associated with the new year, perhaps decorated with plum blossoms, and therefore symbolize perseverance. The scroll in the alcove might feature calligraphy, reading, "First dream of spring," or something equally optimistic. Though outside the tea room, it's quite probably still freezing. So one might place a single camellia flower in the alcove. Its petals are deep red against dark leaves. The flower will last approximately 3 days before dropping its petals in a manner that some find poetic and others find messy. The tea room accommodates both interpretations without comment. Cherry blossoms dominate the aesthetic consciousness of the entire nation, which must be exhausting for everyone involved. Tea practitioners, however, tend toward restraint. Perhaps a single branch of cherry blossom, just beginning to open, placed in a simple bamboo vase. Not a full bouquet, never a full bouquet. That would be showing off, and showing off is antithetical to the entire enterprise. The sweet served before tea, the wagashi, also changes with seasons. In spring, perhaps a confection shaped like a cherry blossom, made from white bean paste and colored with natural dyes, pink and pale green. It's almost too beautiful to eat, which is rather the point, though one eats it anyway because the host has gone to considerable trouble, and it would be impolite to refuse. The sweetness of the wagashi balances the bitterness of the tea, or so the theory goes. In practice, one tastes a very sweet bean paste, followed shortly by very bitter green tea, and the contrast is somewhat startling. Though one doesn't mention this, one simply eats and drinks and appreciates that someone thought to balance these flavors, even if the balance feels more theoretical than actual. Summer tea ceremony presents its own challenges, primarily heat. The tea room, with its small size and limited ventilation, becomes rather like a sauna, though without the socially acceptable nudity. Hosts adapt by using shallower tea bowls, as mentioned earlier, and by serving usucha thin tea instead of koicha, the thick tea served in winter. Thin tea uses less matcha powder and more water, creating a lighter, less viscous beverage that one can drink without feeling one has consumed a meal. The scroll might feature calligraphy reading "cool breeze" or depict a waterfall, neither of which actually makes the room cooler but provides psychological relief, which is apparently sufficient. The scroll might show grasses bending in wind or a single leaf suspended in its descent. The tea bowl might be decorated with maple leaves in shades of red and gold. Everything becomes a meditation on impermanence, which sounds profound, but mostly means acknowledging that winter is coming and one should probably find a warmer coat. The tea ceremony has, over centuries, accumulated layers of meaning and tradition that can feel overwhelming to newcomers. There are rules about which hand picks up the tea bowl first, rules about how many times one rotates it, rules about where one's knees should point while sitting, rules about rules probably, governing how rules should be implemented, and yet, within all this structure, there's a peculiar freedom, because the rules are so specific, so thoroughly defined, one's mind doesn't need to wonder what to do next. The body follows the forms, and the mind is free to simply observe. The color of the tea, the warmth of the bowl, the play of light on the wall, the sound of another person breathing quietly across the tatami. This perhaps is what Rikyū understood, that by constraining the external, the movements, the space, the objects, one could liberate the internal, that by making everything exactly so, one could stop worrying about whether things were exactly so. Though I imagine he put it more poetically. He was Japanese after all, and they have rather a gift for making mundane observations sound profound. Something about tea being just tea, except when it isn't, except when it is. You know the sort of thing. The tea room itself, the chashitsu, deserves closer examination, though this may require us to sit still for rather a long time, which seems appropriate given the subject matter. These rooms are not simply small spaces where tea happens to be served. They are architectural statements about humility, or perhaps architectural statements about making architectural statements about humility, which is already getting rather meta. The entrance to a traditional tea room is called a nijiriguchi, which translates to crawling in entrance, and this is not metaphorical. It's a small opening, roughly 2 feet square, requiring guests to remove their swords if they happen to be 16th century samurai and crawl on their hands and knees into the space. This enforced humility means everyone enters in the same undignified manner, regardless of whether they're a feudal lord or a rice merchant. The ceiling height varies throughout the room, which seems like poor planning until you realize it's entirely intentional. Above the host's position, the ceiling might be quite low, perhaps 6 feet, while above the guest's area, it rises to 7 or 8 feet. This creates a subtle psychological effect. The host appears smaller, less imposing, while guests feel more spacious, more honored. It's manipulation through architecture, which is somehow more acceptable when done with wood and plaster than with words. The walls are often made of clay mixed with straw, left rough and unfinished. You can see the texture, the irregularities, sometimes even the imprints of the hands that smoothed them. This is deliberate rusticity, which is rather different from accidental rusticity, though the end result looks similar to the untrained eye. The trained eye apparently, can detect the difference and will spend considerable time discussing it over tea, which seems like proving someone's point about having too much time on one's hands. The alcove, the tokonoma, occupies the most important position in the room. It's a shallow recess, raised slightly above the floor level, where the scroll hangs and the flower arrangement sits. Nothing else belongs there. No kettles, no tea bowls, no stray objects that someone forgot to put away. The tokonoma is sacred space, which is a grand term for empty shelf with one or two things on it. The scroll hanging in the tokonoma is called a kakemono, and it's selected with agonizing care to match the season, the occasion, the weather, the host's mood, the guest's probable moods, and possibly the alignment of the planets. Though sources differ on this last point. The scroll might feature calligraphy, a Zen phrase. Perhaps something paradoxical and vaguely unsettling, like the sound of one hand clapping, or what is your original face before your parents were born? These questions don't require answers, which is fortunate, because they don't really have answers. Or rather, they have infinite answers, or no answers, depending on your perspective and how much tea you've consumed. The point is to sit with the question, to let it percolate in your mind while the water percolates in the kettle, which is either profound or simply two things happening simultaneously, depending again on your perspective. Alternatively, the scroll might feature a painting ink on paper or silk, monochrome, or with subtle color, perhaps a bird on a branch, painted with just a few brushstrokes. The bird's eye, a single dot of ink, its entire personality somehow conveyed in that dot. Or a landscape, mountains emerging from mist. The mist itself, just blank paper. The artist understanding that sometimes what you don't paint is more important than what you do. The flower arrangement beside the scroll is called shabana, literally tea flower, and it follows different rules from other forms of Japanese flower arrangement. Ikebana can be quite elaborate, with multiple branches and flowers arranged in complex geometric patterns. Chabana is simpler. One flower, perhaps two, arranged to look as though they're still growing naturally, as though someone simply plucked them from a field and placed them in water, which is exactly what happened. Though simply is doing considerable work in that sentence. The container for the flowers is often a humble object, a bamboo tube, a rough ceramic vase, sometimes even an old wooden bucket. Nothing ostentatious. The flower itself should never be too perfect. A camellia blossom, just beginning to brown at the edges, is more valued than one in pristine bloom. A morning glory that will wilt within hours is chosen precisely because it will wilt within hours, because its impermanence makes it more precious. Or so the philosophy goes. This aesthetic principle, finding beauty in imperfection and transience, has a name, Wabi-sabi. The term combines wabi, which we discussed earlier as rustic simplicity, and sabi, the beauty of age and wear. Together, they create a worldview that celebrates things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. A cracked tea bowl, a weathered stone, a petal falling from a flower. These are not failures of preservation, but evidence of existence, proof that these objects have lived and are living still. The tea bowls themselves embody wabi-sabi, perhaps more than any other object in the ceremony. Some of the most valuable tea bowls in existence are deliberately asymmetrical, with glazes that ran incorrectly in the kiln, with thumbprints pressed into the clay, with cracks that have been repaired with gold lacquer, a technique called kintsugi that doesn't hide the damage but highlights it, making the repair part of the bowl's history, part of its beauty. There's a famous tea bowl called Fujisan, Mount Fuji, which is roughly shaped like Japan's most famous mountain if you squint and tilt your head and have consumed a moderate amount of sake. It's irregular, asymmetrical, the glaze dripping unevenly down one side. It's also worth approximately the same as a small house, which seems like rather a lot of money for a cup with imperfections, until you realize the imperfections are the point, at which point you've either understood Wabi-sabi or decided the Japanese tea world has lost its collective mind. The glazes on tea bowls deserve their own chapter, possibly their own book, possibly their own library. There's Rikyū, a type of low-fired ceramic that's removed from the kiln while still glowing hot and placed in combustible material, creating unpredictable effects in the glazed black Rikyū. Red Rikyū, each piece unique. There's Shino, with its thick white glaze that sometimes pulls away from the clay body, creating patterns that look like snow melting on stone. There's Oribe, with its copper-green glaze and painted designs, slightly more decorative than other styles, but still restrained by normal standards. Potters who make tea bowls are revered in Japan, some of them designated as living national treasures, which is an actual title bestowed by the government. Imagine being so accomplished at making cups that your country declares you a national treasure. These potters often come from generations of potters, families who have been working with clay for centuries, passing down techniques and knowledge from parent to child, each generation adding small innovations while maintaining tradition. The creation of a tea bowl is itself a meditative process. The potter centers the clay on the wheel, feeling its weight, its moisture content, its willingness to be shaped. The wheel spins, the hands apply pressure, and the clay rises into form. This rising, called pulling, requires sensitivity. Too much pressure, and the clay collapses. Too little, and it doesn't rise. The potter must find the balance, must feel the clay's response and adjust accordingly. Some tea bowls are thrown on a wheel, others hand-built, pinched, and coaxed into shape. Some are perfectly symmetrical, others deliberately warped, shaped by hands into forms that lean slightly to one side. These bowls are then dried slowly, over days or weeks, to prevent cracking. Then they're fired, first to a low temperature to harden the clay, then glazed, then fired again to a higher temperature where the glaze melts and fuses with the clay body. During this second firing, things happen that no one can entirely control. The atmosphere in the kiln, whether it's rich in oxygen or starved of it, affects the glaze color. The placement of the bowl in the kiln matters. The temperature variations, the length of firing, even the weather outside can influence the result. The potter loads the kiln with intention, but must accept surprise, must embrace the kiln's contribution to the work. This acceptance of the uncontrollable is central to the tea aesthetic. You can practice the ceremony for decades, perfect your movements, learn all the forms, acquire beautiful utensils, and still the charcoal might not light properly, or the water might boil too quickly, or a guest might sneeze at an inopportune moment. The ceremony continues regardless. Perfection is not the goal. Presence is the goal. Attention is the goal. The willingness to make tea and drink tea, despite all the variables that conspire against such a simple act, this is the goal. The tea itself, the matcha powder, comes from tea plants that are shaded for several weeks before harvest. This shading causes the plants to produce more chlorophyll and amino acids, creating that deep green color and umami flavor that characterizes matcha. The leaves are hand-picked, steamed to prevent oxidation. The grinding process is extraordinarily slow. The stones can produce only about 40 grams of matcha per hour, which means the powder you're whisking into your tea bowl represents hours of careful grinding, weeks of shade growing. The taste of matcha varies depending on the grade. The highest grades used in tea ceremony are smooth, vegetal, with a natural sweetness beneath the bitterness. Lower grades can be astringent, harsh, suitable perhaps for putting in lattes, but not for serving to guests who've just crawled through a small door and sat on their knees for 45 minutes, waiting for you to finish wiping down your tea scoop. There's an entire vocabulary for describing tea, just as there is for wine or coffee. Terms like koku, a rich depth of flavor, or umami, a clean freshness. Experienced tea practitioners can identify not just the quality of the matcha, but sometimes even which region it's from, which farm, which harvest. This level of discernment takes years to develop, which sounds like a pleasant way to spend one's time until you remember that matcha contains significant amounts of caffeine, and tasting hundreds of teas probably results in several sleepless nights and a deep understanding of one's own pulse rate. The tea garden, the roji, provides the transitional space between the ordinary world and the tea room, though calling it a garden might conjure images of roses and herbaceous borders, which would be entirely wrong. The roji is more accurately described as a path, a deliberate journey from one state of mind to another, executed in approximately 30 feet of carefully arranged stones and strategically placed moss. The stepping stones themselves are chosen with what can only be described as obsessive attention. They should be natural, not cut into regular shapes. They should be placed irregularly, forcing you to watch your step, to pay attention to where you're putting your feet, rather than where you're going. The spacing between stones is calculated so that your gait slows, becomes more measured, more deliberate. You cannot rush across stepping stones placed 2 feet apart at odd angles. Well, you can, but you'll probably fall into the moss, which would be embarrassing, and rather defeat the purpose of achieving a meditative state. The path typically includes a stone water basin, a tsukubai, where guests purify their hands and mouths before entering the tea room. The basin is low, requiring you to crouch, which again enforces humility through posture. The water in the basin is fresh, cold, often fed by a bamboo pipe that drips steadily, one drop at a time, creating a soft rhythm that's somehow both regular and unpredictable, like a metronome with a mind of its own. Beside the basin sits a small stone lantern, perhaps. The lantern's presence is enough. It suggests the possibility of light, the potential for illumination, which is apparently more meaningful than actual illumination, though this may be reading too much into what is ultimately a decorative rock with a hole in it. The plants in the roji are selected for their subtlety. No bright flowers shouting for attention. Instead, ferns, moss, bamboo, evergreens that look essentially the same in all seasons. The moss especially receives tremendous attention. There are gardeners in Japan whose entire professional lives revolve around moss cultivation. This moss must be the right shade of green, not too bright, not too dull. It must cover the ground evenly, but not too evenly, because perfect evenness looks artificial. It must appear ancient, even if planted last Tuesday. Achieving this appearance requires patience, water, shade, and probably a degree of self-delusion about what constitutes a productive use of one's time. The gate at the entrance to the roji is often simple 2 posts and a roof, perhaps with no actual gate to close, because who would steal a path made of irregular stones? This gate marks the boundary between the outside world and the tea world, though the boundary is entirely conceptual, and you could simply walk around the gate if you wanted to, but that would be missing the point, which is to acknowledge transitions, to mark the movement from one space to another with intention, rather than simply barging through because you're late for tea. Some tea gardens include a small waiting area, a machiai, where guests sit before being invited into the tea room proper. This waiting is not empty time, but preparatory time, time to settle one's mind, which is usually concerning regardless of century. The waiting area might have a small bench, a simple roof, a view of the garden path ahead. You sit. You wait. You watch drops of water falling from the bamboo pipe into the stone basin. The tea utensils beyond the bowl deserve their own consideration, though I realize we're now quite deep into the minutiae of objects used to make and serve a hot beverage, which may seem excessive, but then again, we're discussing a ceremony that takes 4 hours. So excess is rather the defining characteristic. The tea scoop, the chashaku, is carved from a single piece of bamboo, curved gently like a miniature canoe, with one end slightly wider than the other. The curve is not random, but designed to hold exactly the right amount of tea powder for one serving. Assuming the person scooping has practiced thousands of times and has internalized what the right amount means without needing to measure. Each scoop has a name, given by the person who carved it, or by a tea master who used it. These names are often seasonal or poetic. Frozen stream, dawn moon, withered branch. Calling a bamboo spoon withered branch seems rather on the nose, but poetry has never been my forte. The tea whisk. It's carved from a single piece of bamboo, split into 80 or 100 or 120 fine tines, each one flexible enough to whisk tea, but strong enough not to break, which requires a level of craftsmanship that probably deserves more recognition than it receives. The whisk maker, and yes, whisk maker, is a specific profession. Splits the bamboo with a knife, carefully, evenly, creating tines of identical thickness, then shaves them thinner, shapes them, curves them inward, so they form a bulbous shape that efficiently agitates the tea powder into suspension. A good chasen might last a year with regular use, perhaps 2 if you're careful. The tines eventually break. The bamboo loses its flexibility, and you retire the whisk to a small shrine or temple, even if that tool is technically just a stick with splits in it. This practice of honoring used utensils, kuyo, extends to other tools as well: needles, scissors, even worn-out sandals. There's something touching about this. The acknowledgement that objects have served a purpose, have been part of your life, and deserve gratitude rather than casual disposal. The tea caddy, the natsume for thin tea or chair for thick tea, holds the matcha powder. These containers are often lacquered wood, smooth to the touch, light in weight, decorated with designs that range from simple to elaborate. Some have scenes painted in gold lacquer. Autumn grasses, plovers in flight, waves crashing on rocks. Others are plain black or red, their only ornament being the quality of the lacquer itself, which can be built up in dozens of layers, each one applied and dried and polished before the next is added, creating a depth and luminosity that seems to glow from within. The finest lacquerware can take years to complete. The artisan applies layer after layer, sanding between coats, building up the surface gradually until it achieves that characteristic depth. Some lacquer contains gold powder, silver powder, mother-of-pearl inlays. Some is decorated using a technique called maki-e, where designs are drawn in lacquer and then sprinkled with metal powder before drying, creating images that seem to float on the surface. These containers hold perhaps 20 grams of tea powder, enough for several servings. Before using the caddy, the host wipes it with the silk cloth, holds it carefully, places it in exactly the right position on the tatami. The caddy is not simply a storage container. The silk cloth itself, the fukusa, is typically a single color, purple for women, orange or red for men, though these conventions are fluid and depend on which school of tea you're following. The cloth is approximately 1 foot square, made of fine silk, and it serves multiple purposes: wiping utensils, handling hot objects, and demonstrating that you know the 17 different ways to fold a square of fabric. The folding of the fukusa is a performance in itself. The host holds the cloth, spreads it flat, folds it in half, then in half again, then performs a series of movements that transform it into a compact pad suitable for wiping the tea scoop. Then it's unfolded, refolded differently, and used to handle the lid of the tea caddy. Each fold has meaning, or at least intentionality, which may be the same thing or may be completely different depending on your philosophical orientation at the moment. The water ladle, the hishaku, is made of bamboo with a wooden handle, simple and functional. It holds approximately 1 ladle of water, which is both obvious and the entire point. You don't pour water directly from the kettle because the kettle is hot and awkward, and you'd probably splash water everywhere and ruin the meditative atmosphere with cursing. The ladle allows precision, control, grace. You dip it into the kettle, lift it slowly so water doesn't drip. Pour the water into the tea bowl in a smooth arc, then rest the ladle on the kettle's rim with the handle angled just so, because even the resting position of a ladle matters. The lid rest, futaoki, is a small object, often ceramic or bamboo, shaped like a ring or a small vase, on which the kettle lid rests when removed. This sounds trivial until you realize that placing a wet, hot lid directly on the tatami would damage the mat, and holding the lid while you ladle water would require 3 hands, which most people lack. The lid rest is therefore a problem-solving device disguised as another object requiring careful selection and placement. Some lid rests are quite beautiful. Porcelain shaped like flowers, bamboo carved with nodes intact, metalwork with pierced designs. Others are plain, functional, their beauty residing in their simplicity. The host chooses which to use based on season, formality, and personal preference. The wastewater container, kensui, receives the water used to rinse the tea bowl between servings. It's typically a wide, shallow bowl, often ceramic, sometimes metal, with a shape that allows easy pouring without splashing. The sound of water being poured into the kensui, a gentle rushing, a brief turbulence. Then stillness becomes another element of the ceremony's soundscape, along with the kettle's rumbling and the whisks' soft scratching against ceramic. Even this wastewater is not thoughtlessly discarded. At the ceremony's conclusion, the host carefully carries the kensui from the room, presumably to dispose of the water properly. Though one suspects properly involves more consideration than simply dumping it down the nearest drain. Everything in the tea ceremony resists casual treatment, insists on attention, demands that each action be executed with awareness rather than habit. The relationship between tea ceremony and Zen Buddhism deserves examination, though discussing Zen Buddhism runs the risk of either saying too much or too little, both of which are apparently wrong according to Zen Buddhism itself, which is rather the problem with discussing it in the first place. Zen arrived in Japan from China around the same time as tea, brought by those same monks who apparently couldn't leave well enough alone and had to import both caffeine and paradoxical philosophy simultaneously. Zen emphasizes direct experience over scripture, meditation over intellectual understanding, and generally makes a virtue of being cryptic, which either reveals profound truths about the nature of reality or provides excellent cover for not having clear answers to questions, possibly both. The connection between Zen and tea ceremony is often described as natural, inevitable. Zen meditation, zazen, involves sitting still, usually facing a wall, paying attention to your breath, watching your thoughts arise and dissipate without engaging with them. Tea ceremony involves sitting still, usually facing another person. Both practices cultivate mindfulness, though that word has become rather overused in recent years, appearing on everything, from meditation apps to corporate wellness programs, to the packaging of expensive herbal teas that have nothing to do with actual tea ceremony. The original concept, nen, is more specific, maintaining awareness in the present moment, neither dwelling on the past nor anticipating the future, simply being present with what is happening now, which sounds straightforward until you try it for 30 seconds and realize your mind has already wandered to 3 different topics and is making a shopping list. Zen koans, those paradoxical questions we mentioned earlier, sometimes appear in tea ceremony contexts, written on scrolls, offered as topics for contemplation. What is the sound of one hand clapping? S. Well, it's silence, obviously. But saying that misses the point, which is to sit with the question, to let it work on you like water on stone, gradually, over time, wearing away your certainty until you arrive at something, understanding perhaps, or confusion, so complete it becomes indistinguishable from understanding. Again, Zen is not terribly helpful with clear distinctions. There's a famous Zen saying, "After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The implication being that enlightenment doesn't transform your daily tasks, but transforms your relationship to them. The wood is still wood, the water still water, but somehow, the chopping and carrying contain the entire universe, or you realize they always did, or you stop worrying about whether they do, and just chop and carry, without the burden of meaning-making. Tea ceremony applies this principle directly. Before understanding tea ceremony, you make tea. After understanding tea ceremony, you make tea. The movements are the same, the utensils identical, the tea tastes no different. But perhaps, and this is speculation, the practitioner's experience changes. The making of tea becomes not a means to an end, not a task to complete so you can move on to something else, but an end in itself, complete, sufficient, requiring nothing beyond what it already is. This sounds suspiciously like rationalization for spending 4 hours drinking tea. And perhaps it is, but it's rationalization that's persisted for 5 centuries, which suggests either profound wisdom or very committed self-deception. I lean toward the former on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the latter on Wednesdays and Fridays, and remain agnostic on weekends. The concept of ichigo-ichi. One time, one meeting permeates tea ceremony. Each gathering is understood as unique, unrepeatable. Even if you're meeting the same people in the same tea room with the same utensils you used last week. The water is different water. The charcoal is different charcoal. You are different you. Having lived another week, acquired new experiences, lost cells, and grown new ones. The universe has shifted, however imperceptibly. And this moment will never come again exactly as it is now. This philosophy encourages practitioners to treat each ceremony as though it might be their last. It's simultaneously life-affirming and rather morbid, celebrating the preciousness of the present moment, while acknowledging that everything ends, that impermanence is the only permanent thing, that nothing lasts except change itself. The tea masters who shaped the ceremony understood this deeply, lived it completely, and sometimes died because of it. Sen no Rikyū, as mentioned earlier, was ordered to commit ritual suicide by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the most powerful man in Japan at the time. The reasons remain unclear: political intrigue, personal offense, possibly just Hideyoshi's paranoia, which was considerable. Rikyū performed the ritual with the same precision he brought to tea ceremony, using a tea ceremony knife for the act, composing a death poem beforehand, dying as he had lived. With attention to detail and impeccable form, his death poem is worth noting. Though poetry in translation always loses something, like explaining a joke or describing music to someone who's never heard sound. It goes roughly: I raise the sword, this sword of mine, long in my possession. The time is come, heavenward I throw it up. Nuances about karma and the nature of reality. But the essential message is clear. Even death is just another action to be performed with awareness, another moment to meet fully. This seems rather intense for what is ostensibly a meditation on making tea. But then tea ceremony has always contained multitudes, has always been about more than tea, while insisting it's only about tea, which is very Zen and very confusing, and probably exactly as it should be. Other tea masters had less dramatic ends. Takano-jo, Rikyū's teacher, was a merchant who studied poetry and Zen and tea, combining these interests into a lifestyle that valued simplicity and sincerity. He's less famous than Rikyū, but perhaps more relatable, being someone who had a regular job and pursued tea as a serious practice, without making it his entire existence. Though actually, given how much time tea ceremony requires, it probably was his entire existence. Never mind. Furuta Oribe, a student of Rikyū, developed his own style after his teacher's death. Oribe's approach was slightly more flamboyant, more willing to incorporate color and asymmetry and bold design. Oribe ware ceramics. Those pieces with green glaze and abstract painted designs reflect this aesthetic. They're still wabi-sabi, still embracing imperfection, but with more personality, more willingness to make statements. Oribe himself eventually ran afoul of political powers and was also ordered to commit suicide, which suggests that being a tea master in 16th and 17th century, Japan was a considerably more dangerous occupation than one might expect. Kobori Enshu, another student of Oribe, took the practice in a different direction, toward greater refinement and aristocratic elegance. Enshu served the Tokugawa shogunate, designed gardens, advised on architecture, and generally represented tea ceremonies' establishment phase. When it had moved from rebellious simplicity, his style is beautiful, precise, perhaps slightly less raw than Rikyū's original vision, but more accessible to people who wanted beauty without quite so much emphasis on rustic imperfection. These different schools, Rikyū's descendants, and his students' lineages continue today. Separate traditions of which utensils to use when. The differences are subtle. An outsider watching ceremonies from different schools might not notice anything distinct, but practitioners know. They recognize the angle of a bow, the number of cloth folds, the positioning of the whisk after use. These details identify which tradition you follow, which teacher taught your teacher, creating lineages that stretch back centuries, connecting you to Rikyū himself, or to Oribe, or to Enshu, through an unbroken chain of transmitted knowledge. This transmission sorden is taken seriously. Students don't simply read books about tea ceremony and start practicing. They study with a teacher, attend classes for years, decades, progressing through levels of certification that mark their increasing knowledge. There are introductory levels, intermediate levels, advanced levels, teaching licenses, and usually a ceremony where certificates are presented with great formality, everyone wearing formal kimono, sitting in proper position, bowing at prescribed moments. The teaching method is primarily observation and repetition. The teacher performs the ceremony, students watch. Then students attempt the ceremony themselves. The teacher corrects. This happens hundreds of times, thousands of times, until the movements become internalized, until your hands know what to do without conscious thought, until you can perform the ceremony while your mind remains quiet, observant, present. This learning process is slow, deliberately so. You cannot rush mastery, cannot accelerate understanding by reading more books or watching more videos. The body needs time to learn, muscles need to develop memory. The mind needs to settle into the practice gradually, layer upon layer, like lacquer building depth through repeated application. Some students find this frustrating, want faster progress, want to be told explicitly what everything means, rather than discovering meaning through practice. These students often quit, which is perhaps for the best. Tea ceremony self-selects for patience, for people willing to spend years learning the proper way to wipe a tea scoop, for people who find meaning in repetition rather than novelty, tradition rather than innovation. Though innovation does occur, slowly, incrementally. Contemporary tea practitioners sometimes incorporate modern materials, stainless steel kettles, electric braziers, while maintaining traditional forms. Some experiment with Western settings, performing ceremonies in non-Japanese buildings, using local flowers in the alcove, adapting the practice to new contexts while preserving its essential character. This adaptation ensures tea ceremony remains living practice rather than museum piece, continues evolving while maintaining connection to its roots. The spread of tea ceremony to the West is a story of enthusiastic misunderstanding, followed by gradual comprehension. Though gradual is perhaps generous, as we're now approximately 150 years into the process, and many Westerners still think tea ceremony is primarily about the tea, which it isn't, though explaining what it actually is about takes considerably longer than most Westerners have patience for. The first significant Western exposure to tea ceremony came in the late 19th century, during Japan's Meiji period, when the country opened to international trade after centuries of isolation. Western visitors to Japan encountered many things that confused them: the writing system, the architecture, the cuisine, the social customs, and tea ceremony was simply one more bewildering practice to add to the list. Early accounts describe it as quaint, charming, and incomprehensible. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago featured a Japanese pavilion where tea ceremonies were performed for curious Americans who had presumably never seen anyone take 4 hours to prepare a beverage. The demonstrations were popular, though one suspects the audience appreciated the exotic spectacle more than the underlying philosophy. People watched, applauded politely, and went home thinking they'd witnessed a charming cultural curiosity, like folk dancing or traditional costume, failing to grasp that they'd just observed a living spiritual practice. Okakura Kakuzo's book, The Book of Tea, published in 1906, attempted to explain tea ceremony to Western readers. Okakura wrote in English, having lived in America, and he understood he was translating not just language, but entire worldviews. He tried to make Wabi-sabi comprehensible to people whose aesthetic values centered on symmetry, permanence, and obvious beauty. He described tea ceremony as a religion of aestheticism, which sounds lovely but probably confused more than it clarified, as Western readers familiar with religion expected something involving God or salvation, not carefully arranged flowers and irregular tea bowls. The book became influential among Western intellectuals and artists who were already interested in Japanese aesthetics, people involved in the aesthetic movement, arts and crafts movement, various other movements that involved capitalizing words and caring deeply about decorative arts. They appreciated Okakura's emphasis on simplicity, his critique of Western materialism, his suggestion that beauty could be found in everyday objects and actions. Whether they fully understood tea ceremony is debatable, but they found in it permission to value things their own culture dismissed as unimportant: handmade ceramics, natural materials, asymmetry, age, and wear. After World War II, American occupation forces in Japan encountered tea ceremony again, this time with more sustained exposure. Some soldiers and officials became genuinely interested, studied with teachers, tried to understand the practice beyond its surface. Others collected tea bowls and whisks as souvenirs, objects divorced from their context, decorative items to place on shelves back home, which rather defeats the purpose, but is at least better than not being interested at all. The 1960 seconds and 70 seconds saw increased Western interest in Zen Buddhism, driven partly by beat poets and counterculture movements that found in Zen an alternative to Western religious and philosophical traditions. D. T. Suzuki's writings on Zen reached wide audiences. Alan Watts made a career explaining Eastern philosophy to Westerners, and suddenly everyone was reading about Satori and Kensho, and the sound of one hand clapping. Tea ceremony benefited from this interest, being closely associated with Zen, though many Westerners approached it as another path to enlightenment rather than as a specific cultural practice with its own integrity. Tea ceremony schools began accepting Western students more formally during this period. The Urasenki school particularly made efforts to spread tea ceremony internationally, establishing branches in America, Europe, Australia. Teachers traveled abroad, conducted workshops, certified Western students who then taught others. This created challenges. How do you perform tea ceremony in a house without tatami mats? Do you require students to sit in seiza if their bodies aren't accustomed to it? Can you use local flowers instead of Japanese varieties? Should ceremonies be conducted entirely in Japanese, or can instructions be given in English? Different teachers answered these questions differently. Some insisted on strict adherence to Japanese forms, requiring tatami, Japanese flowers, Japanese language, arguing that tea ceremony is a cultural package that loses meaning when elements are removed or substituted. Others took a more flexible approach, allowing chairs instead of floor sitting, local flowers, bilingual instruction, believing the essential principles could be maintained while adapting external forms to new contexts. This tension between authenticity and accessibility continues today. Some Western practitioners travel regularly to Japan, study with Japanese teachers, maintain connections to lineage schools, strive to practice tea ceremony as it would be practiced in Kyoto. Others develop more hybrid approaches, incorporating Western aesthetic sensibilities while maintaining core principles, creating something that is neither purely Japanese nor purely Western, but some synthesis of both. The physical challenges of tea ceremony in Western bodies deserve mention, though it's slightly indelicate to discuss bodily discomfort in the context of spiritual practice. Westerners, generally speaking, do not grow up sitting on the floor. We have chairs, sofas, car seats, office furniture designed to support bodies in specific positions. Sitting in seiza, kneeling with your bottom resting on your heels, puts pressure on knees, ankles, and feet in ways Western bodies find excruciating after approximately 5 minutes. Japanese people also find seiza uncomfortable, but they've been sitting this way since childhood, have developed flexibility and tolerance through years of exposure. Western practitioners, coming to tea ceremony as adults, face a steeper learning curve. Some use small benches, others simply endure the discomfort, considering it part of the practice. Another opportunity to observe bodily sensation without reacting, to maintain composure despite pins and needles. This physical struggle with seiza is rarely mentioned in poetic descriptions of tea ceremony, which prefer to focus on spiritual refinement and aesthetic contemplation, rather than acknowledging that everyone's feet have fallen asleep, and standing up afterward requires considerable dignity to avoid falling over. The tea itself presents another challenge for Western palates. Matcha is not Earl Grey. It's not chamomile or peppermint or any other tea Westerners typically drink. It's intensely vegetal, somewhat bitter, with a texture that's simultaneously smooth and slightly gritty from the powder. Some Westerners taste it and think, this is interesting, complex, worth acquiring a taste for. This is lawn clippings in hot water, which is not entirely inaccurate as a description, though perhaps lacking in poetic sensitivity. Western tea ceremony practitioners must also navigate the economics of the practice. Traditional utensils are expensive, especially if imported from Japan. A decent tea bowl might cost several $100s. A good whisk, $20 to $50. The silk cloths, the tea scoops, the lacquered caddies, these add up quickly. Some practitioners invest in authentic Japanese utensils, valuing the connection to tradition, the craftsmanship, the knowledge that these objects were made specifically for tea ceremony. Others take a more practical approach, using handmade bowls from local potters, whisks purchased online, cloths sewn from silk fabric bought by the yard. This democratizes tea ceremony, makes it accessible to people without significant disposable income, but also raises questions about authenticity, about whether objects made without understanding their purpose can serve that purpose adequately. There's also the question of what happens when tea ceremony encounters Western individualism. Japanese culture, broadly speaking, emphasizes harmony, group cohesion, adherence to social forms. Western culture, broadly speaking, emphasizes individual expression, personal authenticity, questioning authority. These are generalizations, obviously, with many exceptions, but they create different orientations toward practices like tea ceremony. Japanese students learning tea ceremony accept that they will spend years following prescribed forms exactly as taught, without variation, without personal interpretation. The self is submitted to the practice, shaped by it, gradually transformed through repetition and discipline. Western students often struggle with this. They want to understand why each movement is performed a certain way. They want to add personal touches, express their individuality, make the practice their own. The suggestion that they should simply follow the forms without questioning, without understanding, without expressing themselves, feels constraining, even authoritarian. Good teachers navigate this by explaining that the forms aren't arbitrary restrictions, but accumulated wisdom. That personal expression emerges naturally once the fundamentals are internalized, though this requires patience from both teacher and student, a willingness to trust the process, to accept that some things cannot be understood through explanation, but must be lived through experience. Contemporary tea ceremony in the West exists in various forms. Some communities practice very traditionally, maintaining Japanese language, customs, seasonal observances, connections to lineage schools. Others adapt more freely, holding ceremonies in non-Japanese settings, incorporating Western music or poetry, experimenting with fusion approaches that might horrify traditionalists, but engage new practitioners. There are tea houses in unlikely places, a wooden structure in a botanical garden in San Francisco, a converted garage in London, a purpose-built room in a university in Sydney. There are teachers who learned in Japan and teachers who learned from other Western teachers. Lineages becoming increasingly complex, increasingly hybrid, as the practice spreads and adapts. Some Western practitioners travel to Japan for intensive study, attending workshops, staying in temples, immersing themselves in the culture that created tea ceremony. They return home with renewed commitment, deeper understanding, and usually several new tea bowls packed carefully in their luggage, wrapped in multiple layers of paper and cloth, praying they survive the journey intact. The internet has complicated and enriched tea ceremonies spread. YouTube videos demonstrate proper technique, though watching someone whisk tea on a screen is considerably different from whisking tea yourself, feeling the resistance of the powder, hearing the soft scratch of bamboo tines against ceramic. Online communities connect practitioners across continents, sharing photos of tea rooms, discussing philosophy, debating whether one should use 3 folds or 4 when preparing the silk cloth for certain procedures. This connectivity helps Western practitioners feel less isolated. It also creates challenges, as information without context can mislead, as watching videos gives the illusion of understanding without the embodied knowledge that comes only from repeated physical practice. A Turban video production. Thank you for watching. Until the next story. Good night.